They bound prisoners and force-fed them until they were sick, then left them to be devoured by swarms of insects for over 2 weeks. How did the human mind conceive of torments so extreme that even veteran jailers couldn't stomach them? Today, we're uncovering 20 methods of agony so disturbing they've been scrubbed from mainstream history. This isn't about simple pain. It's about calculated, prolonged suffering designed to break the spirit and send a message that would echo for generations. We begin with a punishment that turned the human body into a slow-cooked meal. The act of boiling a person alive appears in legal codes across continents. It wasn't a spontaneous brutality. It was codified, judicial terror. In ancient China, during the Qin dynasty, traders met their end in vast bronze vessels. Centuries later, in Tudor England, King Henry VIII's Parliament passed the Boiling Act, condemning poisoners to the same fate. The process was ritualized. The victim was bound. The liquid, water, oil, or even wine, was heated gradually. Screams would pierce the air, then subside into a sickening silence as shock and scalding took their toll. Death could take minutes, but the psychological impact on witnesses lasted a lifetime. In 1542, a cook named Richard Roos was executed in this manner at London's Smithfield Market before a crowd of thousands. The spectacle was the point. But when fire and water grew mundane, innovators turned to cold, patient iron. Behold the Iron Maiden. Its coffin-like shape and inward-pointing spikes are iconic, but its true horror was in its delayed purpose. You weren't simply placed inside, you were forced in. The spikes were strategically positioned to avoid vital organs, ensuring a prolonged, bleeding demise. Agony was measured in hours, not moments. A victim might last a day, slowly impaling themselves with every shuddering breath. While some historians debate the device's medieval origins, its symbolic power is unquestionable. It represents a shift towards theatrical, psychologically devastating punishment. Some inventions don't showcase genius, but the darkest depths of human ingenuity. Next came a throne of pure agony, the Judas chair. Imagine a seat, a backrest, and armrests, all studded with over 500 sharpened metal points. The condemned, stripped naked, was strapped onto this bed of nails. Any movement, even a trembling breath, drove the spikes deeper. Torturers might tighten the straps incrementally, or worse, light a fire beneath the seat to heat the iron. Used extensively during the Spanish Inquisition, it was less an execution device and more an interrogation tool. The goal was a confession, extracted through hours of relentless, piercing torment. Survivors were often crippled, carrying the physical and psychological scars forever. Then, there was death from the inside out, the so-called pair of anguish. This small, unassuming metal device, shaped like a fruit, held a terrible secret. Inserted into a bodily orifice, a central screw could be turned, causing the instrument's petals to expand violently. It could shatter jaws, tear rectums, or rupture vaginas. It was a tool of shame and intimate violation, often used on those accused of heresy, witchcraft, or sexual crimes. The damage was internal, catastrophic, and often left the victim alive but permanently broken. But what if the torturer wanted to outsource the cruelty to nature itself? Enter the fate of being eaten alive by rats. The victim was secured to a table. A metal cage or pot containing a live rodent was placed on their bare abdomen. Then, the container was heated from above. The panicked, burning animal, with only one route of escape, would begin to burrow, straight down through the victim's flesh. This method was recorded from the Spanish Inquisition to 20th century dictatorships. It was cheap, effective, and horrifyingly slow, as the rodent gnawed its way through skin, muscle, and organ. The Judas cradle or cradle of torture used gravity and sharp geometry as its weapons. A prisoner was suspended above a steep wooden pyramid. They were then lowered, naked, onto its pointed apex. Their own weight became the engine of torture, slowly impaling them. Guards might rock the victim or raise and drop them repeatedly, causing unimaginable internal tearing. Used for crimes from heresy to treason, survival was rare, and death from infection was almost certain. For sheer theatrical cruelty, Few devices rival the brazen bull. Forged from bronze, this hollow statue was a furnace. A person was locked inside, and a fire was lit underneath. As the metal cooked them alive, their screams were channeled through cleverly designed pipes in the bull's snout, transforming them into the bellows of a beast. The inventor, Paralaus of Athens, was said to be its first victim, a grim irony lost on no one. Roman emperors later adopted it for persecuting Christians. The Spanish tickler was deceptively named. This handheld claw of hooked iron was raked across a bound victim's flesh, stripping skin and muscle from the bone in long bloody ribbons. It could reduce a human to a raw, screaming wreck. Sometimes the claws were heated first, adding searing burns to the tearing agony. It was a tool for public punishment, a visceral display of power meant to sicken and subdue any onlooker. Strangulation could be slow and technical, as with the garrote. This device featured a collar and a tightening mechanism, a screw, lever, or twisting stick, that slowly crushed the windpipe or drove a spike into the spinal cord. Marketed as a humane form of execution due to its lack of blood, it was, in reality, a prolonged suffocation. Used into the late 20th century in Spain, it represented the cold, clinical face of state-sanctioned killing. In imperial China, lingqi, or death by 1,000 cuts, was elevated to a horrific art form. The condemned was publicly tied to a frame. An executioner, with meticulous slowness, would make hundreds of non-lethal incisions, removing pieces of flesh. The goal was to keep the victim alive and conscious through as much of the process as possible, sometimes for hours, before a final, mortal cut. It was punishment as profound psychological and physical erasure. The most terrifying punishments aimed not just to end life, but to dismantle a human being piece by piece. For more targeted agony, the thumbscrew was a common favorite. This simple, portable device crushed fingers or toes. A turn of the screw increased pressure until bones shattered. It was a tool of interrogation, used to extract confessions with minimal bloodshed but maximum pain. Survivors were left permanently maimed. The heretic's fork was a tool of psychological warfare. This small device, worn on a strap around the neck, had two sharp prongs, one pressed against the throat, the other under the chin. The victim could not lower their head or speak without stabbing themselves. Forced to remain perfectly still, they were deprived of sleep, driven to madness and collapse over days. The Inquisition used it to break the will before a trial or auto da fe. The knee splitter was exactly as it sounds. Two spiked metal plates were hinged around the knee joint. Turning a handle brought the plates together, driving the spikes into flesh and utterly destroying the joint, ligaments, cartilage, and bone. It was a punishment of deliberate crippling, leaving the victim a broken reminder of the state's power. The breaking wheel was a public spectacle of shattering violence. Tied to a large wagon wheel, the victim's limbs were systematically broken with an iron bar. Sometimes, the shattered body was then woven through the spokes and hoisted on a pole for birds and the elements to claim. The victim might linger for days in this state. Then came scaphism, perhaps one of the most prolonged horrors ever devised. Used in ancient Persia, the condemned was placed between two boats or hollow logs, with their head and limbs protruding. Fours fed milk and honey to induce diarrhea, and then smeared with more honey, they were left exposed. Insects would swarm, feeding on the sweetness and the victim's own waste, eventually burrowing into and consuming the living flesh. Death by sepsis and gangrene could take over a week. Breast rippers were instruments of gendered terror. Used primarily on women accused of adultery, heresy, or witchcraft, these iron claws were used to seize, tear, and remove breast tissue. It was a punishment designed to mutilate the symbols of femininity and motherhood, often performed publicly to amplify the humiliation. Another variant of impalement, the Judas cradle, has been mentioned, but its cousin, the simple stake, was just as feared. Victims were lowered onto a sharpened pole, often greased to prevent immediate fatal bleeding. Gravity and their own weight would cause a slow, internal descent over hours or days. Disembowelment by hook was a brutal art. A large metal hook was inserted into the abdomen, then pulled, unraveling the intestines. In some cases, the victim was forced to walk around a pole, as their guts were wound about it. It was a literal unraveling of life, a grotesque metaphor for treason. Finally, we reach the apex of visceral terror: flaying, the practice of skinning a person alive. Using precise knives, executioners would peel the skin from the body in sheets. The victim remained conscious through much of the process, which could last hours. The Assyrians, Persians, and medieval Europeans all used it. The skin itself was often displayed as a grisly trophy or warning. It represented the ultimate dehumanization, reducing a person to a mere object, a message written in flesh and agony. These 20 methods are a window into a shadow history, where pain was engineered into a language of absolute control. They show us that the boundaries of cruelty are limited only by imagination and the hunger for power. Understanding this dark past isn't about reveling in horror, but about recognizing the depths we must never again plumb. The true torture is realizing how easily humanity can forget its own humanity. If this journey into the shadows of history left an impact, please support Winds of Thought. A like on this video fuels our research, and subscribing ensures you don't miss our next exploration of the truths time tried to hide.